Okay, cool. All right, guys, thanks for joining me here. Mark Burstein. This is our follow-up class to our initial discussion of the California Real Estate Purchase Agreement. Guys, the good news is this isn't too far in the future. Actually, I think this new document's going to be hitting your win forms tomorrow. So it's a good idea that we get acclimated and familiar with it as soon as possible. So I just wanted to go over, just to touch over some of the changes and differences from our from the presentation previously, and then kind of go where we left off in our discussion as we were discussing the back side of the contract. Now, if you remember, right, what are some of the things that are the same versus some of the things that are different in this agreement? Well, the structure of the agreement is very different from what it used to be before. Right now, it is kind of front-loaded with all the information that we're going to fill out is really only on the first few pages. So it makes it easy to decipher when you're comparing multiple offers who has what terms, as the contract is fairly graphical in the sense, that you can easily compare one offer versus the other. But the danger therein lies is that we have, what is it now, 16 pages of document that we're forced our clients need to sign. They need to understand what they're signing and the ramifications of their actions as to what they're signing. And it's up to us to kind of guide them through and help them understand, or at least be able to answer questions should questions arise. Many times in our initial consultations, we do go over this agreement, should go over it in detail, but hopefully your clients can understand it quickly. Therefore, in subsequent offers, it might make our job a little bit easier in explaining it or going through the process. So, I mean, as far as transactionally, guys, nothing really changes. The business of transacting the property stays the same, right? You still have an initial deposit that you take and it's held in escrow. There still is a loan process that the buyer may or may not need to go through. And if there's a loan plot process, then the terms of those loans going forward are about the same. Appraisals tied to loan contingencies is the same. Setting a close of escrow date is the same. The buyer's investigations and loan contingencies are there. The buyers are allowed to investigate the property. And if you read the contract also, it addresses the issues of what happens if there is no contingency. Well, it's okay. The buyer still has the right, even if there isn't a contingency, to investigate the property and make sure that they're comfortable moving forward with what they're buying. The disclosure process is also going to be similar. We're still going to have to fill out the TDS and the SPQ from the sellers. We're still going to have to go through a myriad of forms. Those forms don't change. Those protect us as well as our clients and the broker's interests as well. So make sure that we're comfortable with those forms. The closing and possession terms don't change either, right? You can close escrow. The seller can remain in possession. If they're less than 30 days, you still have to fill out a seller in possession form. If they're going to stay longer than 30 days, then you need the residential lease after sale. That all stays the same. The allocation of costs, who pays for what is going to be, of course, we use guidance from the title companies and what is customary in different counties, right? Who pays for what, that doesn't change. And ultimately it is negotiable, but we still try to adhere to what the customs are in the county to make life easier for everyone. And also the final verification, that stays the same too, right? The seller or the buyer has the right a few days prior to close of escrow to verify that the seller has complied with their contractual obligations and made any agreed upon repairs, and making sure that the seller maintained the property in the same condition as when the offer was made. That stays the same, final verification. Contingency removal process also remains the same. It's called an active contingency removal process, which means that if you do have contingencies in the contract, they must only be removed in writing. Just because the deadline passes does not automatically remove any contingency or protection that contingency provides. The contingencies must be removed in writing. Passive contingency removal isn't even legal in California anymore. So active is what it is. Also, the process of notice to perform. If the other side is not doing what they're supposed to be doing or not conforming to the contract, and your client wants to, or the other party wants to cancel the contract, you still must go through a notice to perform process. Actually, in the new contract, it's slightly changed. In the old contract, it had a default of 3 days, and then you could put whatever you wanted in the checkbox. So people could force people to do in 1 day or even less than a day. But in the new RPA, that's been mitigated. You can't go lower than 2 days in the notice to perform process, and which is fair. It kind of gives everyone a good opportunity to do what needs to be done if they still need the time to get it done. Also, optional liquidated damages and arbitration clauses, those remain the same as well. Liquidated damages, of course, protects your clients to only damages that the seller can keep to the deposit and what it is. And also the arbitration clauses, right? Litigation is very expensive. So the arbitration clauses remain if there's a dispute. Now, keep in mind, guys, that the arbitration clauses in this purchase agreement are between the buyer and the seller, not listing agent buyer or listing agent seller or buyer's agent buyer or buyer's agent seller, right? We are not protected under this agreement with an arbitration clause. If you would like to be protected with an arbitration clause on your transactions, it is an optional document that you can have. I recommend it. It's called arbitration agreement. And that would create an arbitration agreement between you and your clients. Therefore, if there was a dispute, that you would try to settle it first in arbitration. These clauses are there to help us mitigate problems, right? The arbitration clauses are there to help guide the process so that we don't have to incur heavy expenses, but also that we want to make sure that the other side does what they're supposed to do. And the killer for me is the legal fees, right? Legal fees are very expensive. So with the arbitration clauses, first of all, if the other party does not try arbitration first and they go straight to litigation, well, it's their right, they can. But if that's the case, then they lose out on having the other side pay the attorney's fees. So if you want the other side to pay the fees, you got to go through the arbitration process. And that's usually the stickler. If the other side's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's a very simple conversation. Hey, Mr. Other Side, would you like to add on the legal fees to whatever it is you're supposed to be contractually doing? And usually they see the light with that and do what they're supposed to be contractually doing, one way or the other. Mandatory mediation also along those lines. We want to try to settle things out of court. Once you get into if you have to go through the major legal process, it becomes very costly. It becomes very costly both for either side. And if we don't go through the mediation process, arbitration process, which would guarantee the compensation for the prevailing party, it could become very litigious. So I'm glad those protections remain, and we should be comfortable with that. Understand that as well, as we counsel our clients what we're supposed to do. So what's new and quickly better? Contract negotiation points, like I mentioned, are moved to the beginning of the contract. Easy to understand format. The contingency periods all default to the same time period of 17 days, which is funny because I haven't had a contingency on a contract in a little while that long, but keep in mind our car agreement has to govern the entire state, not just our crazy market in Silicon Valley. We have more space between lines and paragraphs and added subparagraphs to make it a little easier to read. You have clear designations of items included. And we have some structural changes as well with regards to how do we deal with mobile homes, probates, tenants in common, stock co-ops, or other tenant occupied properties. We can just use separate addenda if necessary. However, the separate addenda is okay for mobile homes And it can be for probate sales if the probate sale is not complex, meaning there's no court confirmation needed or anything like that. If there is, I still recommend using separate agreements that govern these types of purchases, as well as if we're working with tenant occupied multi-unit residential, so 2 to 4 units, you want to use a residential income purchase agreement. You don't even want to use this contract. All right. So things are reorganized and a little logically grouped to make it easier again to review the contract. Contingencies and disclosures are easier to process because they're in the nice chart. Instead of, oh, you have the loan contingencies in paragraph 2, you have the property contingencies in 14. So, you know, it makes it a little easier when they're all front loaded there. Liquidated damages and arbitration clauses are highlighted. It also avoids missing initials. Sometimes having those optionals in the DocuSign makes it easy to miss those initials. So if it's important to you to have those, you know, counsel your clients about those, make sure that they want them in the contract if you're using the DocuSign processes, and go through DocuSign and make sure that those go from optional to mandatory. Because by default, they'll be optional. And it just makes it really easy if clients are DocuSigning the purchase agreement, makes it really easy for them to skip over those and not initial them when they really want them initial. Then you have to counter offer, and it makes just nonsense. Make sure we get it right the first time. All right. Reorganization of the signature paragraphs makes it easy to identify the subject. Makes it easy to, I guess we don't need the RSCD forms, which show you if you have more than 2 buyers. So it has a little more space so we can have the 3 or 4 buyer situations. I guess as the prices continue to climb, having multiple buyers might be more common. Why not? And then also in the real estate section, it's become a little easier to decipher, and not just decipher, but input the information, because these days, a lot of agents work in groups and teams. So it makes it easier for multiple agents to take credit and liability, of course, on the purchase agreement. So also in the RPA, as you go through it, depending on how you fill out and check the blanks, it will trigger some ancillary forms that you need to be associated or know what they mean. Disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. It's kind of interesting. The agency, they cover multiple times because it's important. So it's important that we understand what those what agency disclosure regarding agency relationships means. Explain that to our clients. If you're working with a manufactured home, then there's a manufactured home purchase addendum. The clients want to exchange, you make sure you have the right paperwork with the exchange seller intent to exchange addendum, the notice to performs, demand to close escrow. That's needed if the seller or buyer, I'm sorry, if the buyer is not, or if the seller is not doing their diligence to do what's necessary. The FERPTAs, obviously, we know FERPTAs, that doesn't change. The seller needs to let the buyer know their tax status so that the buyer can pay the taxes. Still on the buyer, handle the escrow, so don't worry too much about it. If there's a trust, you have to have the trust advisory, backup offer and addendum. If you use backup offers, I personally am not a big fan, especially in a rapidly ascending market like we're experiencing today. Not for the buyer or the seller, but they exist. People like to use them. Good to know what they are. The cooperating broker compensation agreements. And we're going to start seeing these, I think, a little bit more and more and more. We'll see how things devolve out of the exposure of the buyer broker compensation. We'll see if that changes things down the road. If buyer agents may have to start using cooperating broker compensation agreements for their compensation. We might get down to that. Statewide buyer and seller advisory. That's the big 17-page form also counts as the county advisory. This is probably the biggest cover your butt document that there is in all the documents that we have people sign. The good news is you don't have to initial every page anymore. At some point you had to. Actually, they did away with that a little while ago. Just to sign the back. There's a contingency removal form. Obviously, that's going to be the same. And then they have a tenant occupied property addendum, and only use that, guys, if it's a single family home or a condo that's tenant occupied. If it's a duplex to a fourplex, better to use the residential income property agreement. You guys have any basic questions or concerns or anything about just this initial portion? AJ.
The cooperating broker compensation agreement, could you elaborate on why you think that's going to be more important forward?
So if we're working with properties that are off market, you would use this form. Or if the commission that you agreed upon is different than the commission that's on the MLS, then you would use this form. So if the property is off market, for sure you want to use this form. You have no guarantee as a buyer's agent. There is no compensation agreement anywhere with anyone. You know, if the property is placed on MLS, there's an agreement with MLS, and the listing sides adhere to what that MLS commission offered is. But if it's not an MLS, then you have nothing to validate. So use that form, the cooperating broker compensation agreement. And again, we'll see how things go in this new year. I don't think things will change format-wise for us, the way we operate. I think that we'll still see our competitive buyer broker compensation. So I don't think we're going to have to do this all that often, but every now and then, and we'll see it every now and then now too, right? You'll have a listing out there for a couple of $100 commission or a commission less than what most of us would like to get compensated for when working with a buyer, no matter what that is. So if that's the case, right, maybe you negotiate prior to making your offer what your commission would be, and that's what you do. You use the cooperating broker compensation agreement as your paperwork to document your compensation. Any other questions? Concerns? Guys good? If that's the case, then let's jump into this purchase agreement. Guys, I'll see this on screen. Hopefully you guys can all see it and follow along. But this is it. By the way, guys, it's not too late to buy your guide to this new purchase agreement. Obviously, we have this and this lovely recording of this presentation, but if you want a quick and easy reference guide, if you sign up for the class at Score, they charge you $75 for this thing. But through our process here, along with a generous donation to Keller Williams Cares, KW Cares for the office, you can get your copy. And it's whatever you feel is fair. Whatever you donate to KW Cares, Tam and Alan have both committed to matching. So your donation will be tripled. So great impact, and you get a great guide to help you understand this new purchase agreement. It's a great resource to have just in case questions arise from specific parts and you're not quite sure how to explain it, and maybe I'm not available. You can quickly read it in the guide and hopefully get your question answered. And that's what I use to deliver this lovely presentation anyway. So it's not like the information is different. The information is the same. So if you guys would like your guide, please reach out to Stacy let her know how much you'd like to donate to KW Cares, and she will process the payment, and we will send you a nice, lovely guide. I'll be here for you in your mailbox. All right, so enough selling of the guide. Let's get back into the contract. I wish I was a better guide salesman. You know? I'm happy I'm as a real estate broker. Okay. Guys, we kind of went through the first part of this. We did go through the first part of this in detail before, so I'm not going to go through it in detail again. Just a couple of things that I want to make sure you guys fully understand that are different on this, that make an actual significant impact in the way things go forward in your real estate transactions. The number one thing for me that raised an eyebrow was how they dealt with contingencies and paperwork. Guys, with the old purchase agreement and our lovely trend of transacting without contingencies, a lot of times we would rely on technicalities to help our clients gain an advantage. And one of those technicalities would be, well, if the buyer did not receive all the documentation, right? The seller didn't provide the TDS and SBQ and the disclosures. There were no inspections provided up front, right? The buyer would simply, okay, I don't have these things. We'll go without contingencies. And when we get these things, right, the old contract would give you 5 days of contingencies. Well, voila. Now I have new material facts. I have 5 days and I can change my mind, right? And they would use this as a great excuse to backtrack when they would change their mind after making non-contingent offers. Say, well, we didn't get the buyer's agent's avid and we don't like it, so we want to cancel. And they were winning. With the new purchase agreement, it clearly stipulates that if your client is waiving a contingency and they have not received the paperwork, appropriate documentation for that contingency, i.e. TDS, SBQ, any disclosure, any inspection, so forth and so on, that the buyer is taking the risk and releasing the liability or any protections that would have been provided by those documents. So agents, it's up to us to validate and make sure if we're going non-contingent now with this new contract, that the client is aware. And if those documents don't exist, if the seller did not provide those to you up front, well, you really can't go without the proper contingency. If you do, you're taking a huge monumental risk for your clients. Now, sometimes the deal doesn't matter what the house is, right? If it's a fixer-upper, your client's going to demolish it anyway, okay, whatever. But for the majority of our clients that are going to be buying and occupying the properties that, you know, they're looking in, you want to make sure that they know what they're buying. That's why we have these protections for them. Seller disclosures, TDS, SBQ, as well as inspections, so forth and so on. You know, it's a trend in our market to have those inspections up front. And by providing those, then we can reasonably expect the buyer to come aggressive without contingencies or short contingencies. Not because they're waiving any rights, because we provided them a complete disclosure package. We provided them all the seller's disclosures so they can feel comfortable with the condition of the property and their decision to go without a contingency. Ultimately, I think it's safest to have a couple of day contingencies. I know it's not something that's done. It's not something that helps you win in any case, a multiple offer shootout, but it'll help you win in court and it'll help you win to justify your position if you have, or as a listing agent, allow a few days of a contingency. That way the buyer can't come back and say that they were forced or pressured or coerced. All right. So just going to scroll through this top four. Again, the first 3 or 4 pages we covered in detail in the first presentation. So if we did it again in the second presentation, we'll never move forward. I don't think we want to be here all day. I know I don't. As much as I love you guys, I do. All right. So the first 3 pages, again, nice, colorful, a nice chart, make things easy to understand for all parties reviewing the contracts. Followed by the various addenda and advisories that might be necessary or part of the contract. You may want to, as you go through the different advisories, make sure that you include the ones that you want to have as part of the contract. The SBSA doesn't come as a default, but it's going to be in most cases, and most listing agents are going to include that in their disclosures anyway. Sorry, guys, I have itchy fingers. I apologize if I jump forward faster than needs to be. And I'm going through this pretty quick because, again, we went through most of this already in the first section. And basically, to show you how it is, just so you guys can see, anywhere the terms and negotiating points are specified here in the beginning of the contract. But if you want further clarification about these terms and where they're referenced, it's here in this column. We'll reference the paragraph number in the subsequent purchase agreement. So then as you go back through and explain the other 12 pages beyond the chart that the clients are going to be mostly focused on, you can refer back to the chart so you know what portion is being explained. All right, as you're going over their deposits, you're talking about loans, how you're structuring the purchase of the property. I think we talked about the closing in possession last time as well. Whether the buyer intends to occupy the property or not, that affects financing. You want to make sure you're honest about that question, especially if there's a loan. If the buyer's paying with cash, it's less relevant because cash is cash. To buy with cash, there's no lender fraud, no lenders to be defrauded. But if they're buying with a loan, understand that there is a difference between lending terms for primary residences, lending terms for second homes, and lending terms for investment properties. The banks evaluate those lending terms based on risk, and they're aware that if it's your primary residence, chances are you're going to make that payment. Therefore, the interest rate, less risk, interest rates lower. It could be for tempting for certain buyers that want to keep maximizing their profits, if you will, and try to get the very, very lowest rate. And they may want to lie and say, oh, we are going to be, but then we're going to really, the intention is not there to move in. That is lender fraud. Guys, the lenders will check. They will check. They will knock on the door. They expect to see your lovely face. And if it's not there, they're going to wonder and get concerned. And if they realize that it's a rented property, then you could be in big trouble. Lender fraud. There are terms in the loan paperwork that will address this very issue when the client is signing their loan paperwork. So to perpetrate the fraud, it goes beyond just this document. Of course, they're going to have to say it a few more times. But it is what it is. And again, guys, things change in people's situations. And things also, when it comes to these things, have to make sense, right? Things have to make sense. You're not going to go from like a 2,000 square foot house to a 1-bedroom condo. Now, if you're getting divorced, that's one thing. But if you got a family of 4 and they're together and they're saying, oh, well, our new primary residence is this 1-bedroom condo, it doesn't make sense, right? So that could be your first red flag. Seller remaining in possession after close of escrow, or let's say closing in possession, occupancy. We have condition of the property on closing is important. Even though the property is to be sold as is, it doesn't mean that it's as is. It's as is as at the time the offer was made. So at the time the offer was made, the grass was green. Then when the contract closes, maybe 30, 45 days later, the lawn must remain, it's still green, right? The property must be maintained in the same condition. If it's not, you have the final verification of closing conditions where you document any deficiencies. Are these a contingency? Depends on how egregious it is, right? If you're expecting a completed property and the seller thrashes the inside and all the walls are damaged and things are beyond normal, then a buyer may have second thoughts and may be able to cancel and get everything back in extreme senses. But at the end of the day, it's not a contingency of closing. Seller may be in violation of the purchase agreement. So the buyer can still buy the property and close as the contract stipulated, and they have the right to then sue the seller for violating the contract and not maintaining the property. So just because they buy it doesn't absolve, it's not, we're not selling used cars down the road if it, the engine breaks up, sorry, but that's not what we're doing here. Right. If the seller remains in possession after close of escrow, just make sure that the right paperwork is processed. Remember, less than 30 days, it's this one pager, seller in possession form. The reason we want to have these forms is it protects your client in the event that seller decides, I don't want to move. It's like, thanks for my $1 million, but I like this house, I don't want to move. I think it happened maybe 2 years ago. It was popular in the news. There was a situation from Southern California where that very situation actually happened. The seller agreed to sell their property, but then when it came time to take possession, they said, we got COVID. And 2 weeks later, they said, we're not moving. So it created a huge mess and a problem. They didn't have the right paperwork. So it's important that we have the right paperwork. There's stipulations in there. If you don't have the seller in possession form, and that happens, the guy doesn't leave the property. The person doesn't leave the property, the consequences aren't spelled out. But with that SIP form, they are. They are. And you can make them extreme. So that way, even more so motivated to move out. The contingencies are addressed in paragraph 8, all the different ones, they go down the line. You have loan, appraisal, property investigation, title documents, and other seller documents, condominium documents, and the buyer review of leased or liened items contingency. That's all those lovely solar panels and Tesla batteries, things of that nature that are not addressed in previous purchase agreements. And then here where it says removal or waiver of contingencies with the offer. So it says the buyer shall have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless seller has provided all required documents, reports, disclosures, and information pertaining to that contingency. Right? You're not obligated to. But do we? Do they? Can they? Will they? They may try. Up to us to mitigate things. Make sure they're understanding what they're doing. Because if the buyer does remove a contingency without first receiving all required information from the seller, the buyer is relinquishing any contractual rights that apply to that contingency. If the buyer removes or waives any contingencies without an adequate understanding of the property's condition or buyer's ability to purchase, the buyer is acting against the advice of the agent and the broker. So guys, it's important to set expectations, right? If we're working with on the listing side, we're talking to our sellers and strategizing what are some of the best ways we can maximize their returns and lower their headaches. Right, we want to make sure that we have all our documents in order. We want to make sure that we have all our inspections up front. So that way we can expect the buyer to do their diligence up front and review those documents and be comfortable with waiving those contingencies because they have all the information to make those good decisions. If the seller is balking on doing inspections because they cost money, sellers are cheap sometimes, right? Explain the consequence. Well, Mr. Seller, if we don't have these inspections up front, what happens? The buyer may ask for time to conduct inspections and investigations. And at that time, we're negotiating with that buyer one-on-one. The buyer will be in control because they'll have the leverage. They know that if we go back on the market, we may have a stigma associated with our property. We don't want that. They don't want that. Right. Plus, we want to make sure that we get ahead of any issues that could arise to derail our transaction. If we know these things ahead of time, we can mitigate. If we don't know things ahead of time, then we could get stuck. No one likes to get stuck with expenses, especially those that come blindside you, right? Okay. Items included and excluded from the sale. You guys have any questions on those contingencies before I move on that? It's important. I want to make sure you guys are clear. Everyone's clear. If you're still awake. Okay. I guess we're clear. All right. Items included, excluded from the sale. Another lovely point of contention in our transactions. What goes, what comes, what stays. Right, items listed as included or excluded in the MLS, flyers, marketing materials, or disclosures are not included in the purchase price or excluded from the sale unless specified in this paragraph or paragraph 3P or as otherwise agreed. Any items included herein are components of the home and are not intended to affect the price. All items are transferred without any warranty from the seller. It's pretty self-explanatory on that. But we know from real estate class, right? What is included by default is real property. Take the house, turn it upside down, shake it, what falls goes. Right? But some things are a gray area. We want to make sure we clarify, especially if you have TVs affixed to the wall, brackets. We now know that the TVs go unless specifically asked for them to stay, but the brackets stay unless specifically asked to be removed and covered. One of the big things we have to be aware of, and I'm acutely aware of because I like to stage all my vacant properties, is we want to make sure we don't give away the stager's stuff in these contracts. So if the stagers are bringing in window coverings, is probably the big point of contention. If there are no window coverings and the stager is bringing in window coverings, they're going to want to take their window coverings back when they destage the house. And a buyer may be expecting to have some type of window covering and come to empty window coveringless house. So make sure if that's the case that they're addressed and identified excluded. All right. And again, unless there are items excluded from sale, they specify and highlight unless otherwise specified in P1, the brackets attached to the walls, floors, or ceilings for any such component, furniture or item will be removed, and holes or other damage shall be repaired, but not painted. All right. Allocating costs, guys, allocating costs we know goes, we want to stick with what happens traditionally in the county. Keeps things clear for all agents involved. But things can vary, so we also have to be diligent and make sure that we read the contract and validate what's customary is actually what's being written into the contract. It also stipulates that it does not determine who is to pay for any work recommended or identified in the report. So, like, yeah, we know that what has to happen with the transfer of any property. We need to have carbon smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, right? And any water heaters need to be strapped and anchored. These are musts. Property cannot be transferred without these components. But who pays for those is not absolute, right? Typically, the seller is going to handle this thing, but it's not absolute. And we can't have the buyer at the buyer expense take care of those issues. We just can't transfer the property without those issues being handled. Any point of sale requirements need to be completed prior to the final verification of property. Point of sale requirements, there are certain areas, counties that are going to require various inspections for us to comply with. For example, San Francisco has their 3R report and an energy rating report. It's a couple $100. Guy goes through and makes sure that there's not a lot of leakage through the windows and the property has basically meets minimum requirements for energy efficiency. If it's deficient, he'll tell you what needs to be done to solve it. That's a requirement in the city of San Francisco. Certain cities may have sewer lateral inspections and requirements or replacement requirements for the transfer of any property. So understand those requirements for the cities that you are transacting in. Daly City, for example, has that requirement, Berkeley. So understand which city you're working in, make sure you're complying with all their point of sale requirements. Depending on the loans, right? Certain lenders may require a greater level of, I guess, functionality or greater level of condition with regards to certain properties. So they're going to require maybe certain repairs be made, like termite clearances, things of that nature. Make sure that the sellers comply. If the property needs to be re-inspected, it's up to the seller's expense, according to this contract. And then the lovely CYA points on information and advice on requirements. Right, the buyer and seller are advised to seek information from a knowledgeable source regarding local and state mandates and whether they are point of sale requirements or requirements of ownership. Agents do not have expertise in this area and cannot ascertain all of the requirements or costs of compliance. So basically it takes the liability off our shoulders. It's like, Mr. Seller, you have to spend $20,000 to run a new sewer line to sell this house. It's up to us to kind of let them know, but if they get blindsided by that, it ain't my fault, right? It is what it is. It's not, but we should know certain things, and we need to be able to take care of our clients and advise them appropriately. Home warranties. Home warranties are a great idea in many instances, depending on the company. Research for yourselves, but they will also cover your errors and omissions deductible if you use that home warranty, and make sure that all your paperwork is in order. So it's a great mitigation tool. I try to get a home warranty for all my buyers. If they don't want it, I pay for it. Because you never know, guys. You spend, most first-time buyers especially, spend a lot of money to get into a property. Certain unfortunate events could transpire, large expenses. You know, furnace goes out, AC goes out. You know, it's expensive. You can mitigate those costs for a few $100. They pay $75 to get their systems replaced. You're a hero. So consider the home warranty as a nice closing gift. And Section 11 has to deal with the inspections, disclosures, and what the seller needs to provide to the buyer. Right, the seller must provide a transfer disclosure statement, natural hazard disclosure, and other statutory and supplemental disclosures. Right, we used to have, or we do have, right, the flood zones, fault zones, liquefaction zones, and now we also have high or very high fire hazard severity areas. So there are different things. Another thing to look out for, make sure your clients are comfortable buying in those areas. Homeowners insurance, guys, is going to be greatly affected by that high fire hazard severity area. So rural properties, those lovely homes in the Los Gatos, Monastrino Mountains. Yeah. But I guess if you pay $4 or $5 million for a house, you can afford, you know, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year for homeowners insurance. That's what it is. All right. Disclosures, TDS, SBQ, unless the property has transferred to the owner via probate, Those are the only people that are exempt from providing a TDS or an SBQ. Just because maybe a buyer was an investor and they never lived in the property, they still should have, as an investor, manage that property for that period of time and should be able to complete those TDSs and SBQs. However, somebody that inherited the property, never lived in it, never had the chance to manage it, well, that person obviously should not be held accountable for knowing everything about that property. So they are exempt from the TDS or the SBQ. There is still a lovely one-pager that they need to complete called the Exempt Seller Disclosure. So there's still some questions that they can't avoid answering, like death on the property, things of that nature that you should know, even though you may not have owned or lived in the home. All right, the fire hardening disclosure and advisory lets people know how to properly prepare their home. Some guidelines, at least. Defensible space disclosure and addendum. Again, also part of the process, making sure that the properties can survive or mitigate fire as best we can. So return of signed copies, right? Buyer has a certain amount of time, paragraph 3L, or 5 days after delivery of any disclosure, to sign that document, return it back to the seller. Your TCs should be all over this. That's why we use TCs, making sure that the other side's signing all the paperwork that we need. If you're not using a TC, then you need to be all over it. Make sure you get those documents back and everything appropriately signed. All right, termination rights. You need to let either side know how their process would be for terminating terminating the agreement. Withholding taxes. Again, legally, it's up to the buyer to withhold the taxes and pay the taxes on the seller's behalf on the sale of the property. However, we get bailed out by escrow. Escrow actually handles it for us, but we still have to comply with all the necessary paperwork, which means we need to complete the FERPTA form. All right, the Megan's Law database lets people know where to go to find out if there are any unfortunate or any sex offenders in their neighborhood where they are located. Notices regarding gas and hazardous liquids. Condominium plan development disclosures, make sure you get those HOA docs out. Those sellers, again, might be hesitant to spend the money up front. But in our market, guys, they have a motivated seller, which means that they'll be willing to price it properly. The place will sell. You need those HOA documents. Sometimes it takes a few days to get them because the management companies are not always as efficient as we'd like them to be. Understand that those are parameters we have to work with. And when you're taking those listings, we could be proactive. Step one, when you get that listing agreement signed in a condo townhouse, is to go get those documents right away. Start that process. The natural environmental hazards, you have the NHT disclosures, learn about those. Known material facts. The seller must, within the time specified in the paragraph, disclose all known material facts and defects affecting the property, including but not limited to known insurance claims in the past 5 years, or provide buyer with permission to contact lender to get such information and make any and all of the disclosures required by law. Yeah, the disclosures required by law are the TDS and the SPQ. By filling those out, the seller should be covered with their obligations. But they need to answer everything honestly and explain everything that needs explained thoroughly. All right, buyer must investigate the property, matters affecting the property. But understand that they investigate, they inspect the property to a degree, Right, but without the seller's prior written consent, the buyer shall neither make nor cause to be made invasive or destructive buyer investigations, except for minimally invasive testing required to prepare a pest control report, which shall not include any holes or drilling through stucco or similar materials. Inspection by any government building or zoning inspector or government employee unless required by law. So they can inspect to a degree, right? But they can't destroy the house to make sure that there's no termites. That'd be ludicrous. But the seller shall make the property available for all buyers' investigations. The seller is not obligated to move any existing personal property. However, they shall have the water, gas, electricity, and operating pilot lights on. AJ, question?
Sellers, what are they, do they need to, if someone were, if we were to request to look into the crawl spaces that have a crawl space, they require it?
Well, they shouldn't deny anything. They should allow for, if you require access, they should allow for access to these areas should that access be there. So if there is a crawl space latch or hole in the closet, then yes, they should move their items out of that to allow for access. Same with the attic. If there's usually there's this junk in a closet that needs to be moved out so the inspector can get through. However, if those holes don't exist, or if there is no, I've been in homes that they don't have an obvious interior crawl space access. It may be outside, and if it's not outside, then that's a decision the seller and buyer have to come to. Whether you want to create a hole, but they're not obligated to. And the buyer's not obligated to buy the house either. So therein comes a little bit of give and take, and we need to mitigate through. But again, the seller has to make sure that everything is on, right? Water, gas, electricity, and all the pilot lights are on so we can test everything. And again, these things are going to be, again, mitigated by the conditions of the market. If it's a buyer's market, the demands will be greater. If it's a seller's market, the demands will be fewer. All right, title investing has to deal with how the buyers want to take title in the property. They're going to specify that in escrow. If a buyer is a legal entity and the property purchase price is at least $300,000 and the purchase price is made without a bank loan or similar form of external financing, a geographic target order issued by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, U.S. Department of the Treasury, requires title companies to collect and report certain information about the buyer depending on where the property is located. The buyer agrees to cooperate with title company's effort to comply with the GTO. They're not looking for financial crimes, of course. Just want to make sure your clients are aware. I don't want anyone blindsided, right? But if they're going to bring in $500,000 cash, the title company may ask where the cash is coming from. The manner of taking title may have significant legal and tax consequences, so make sure that they understand the difference between tenants in common, joint tenants, and various options therein. Talk about title insurance. Someone's going to be buying that title insurance for the buyer, depending on what the norm is in the county. Santa Clara County, the seller pays title and escrow insurance. However, the seller does not pay the lender's title insurance. That's always on the buyer. If the buyer has a loan, the lender will require title insurance to protect them, and they will require that buyer pay for that. So the buyer pays for that. All right, paragraph 14, time periods, removal of contingencies, cancellation rights. Lets you know how much time you have to review the information that the seller provides. Most cases, guys, remember the information is going to be provided upfront. If the seller does not, right, deliver the seller, the buyer shall, by the end of the time specified in the paragraph 3L, deliver to seller or removal of the applicable contingency or cancel the agreement. However, if any report, disclosure, or information for which the seller is responsible, other than those in paragraph 11A or 11B, is not delivered within the time specified, then the buyer has 5 days after the delivery of such item, or the time specified in paragraph 3L, whichever is later, to remove the contingency. So again, you must have the contingency in order to have this protection in place. If you waive the contingency ahead of time, then you don't have that contingency protection to get those documents in place. But if you have the contingency, then they have time to get that information to you. All right. Seller's right to cancel. The buyer doesn't remove their contingencies in time. After a notice to perform, the seller can cancel. Outside of that, not a good idea for the seller to cancel. Typically significant consequences for that seller cancellation with no reason. Buyers also may cancel, but there's a consequence of losing your deposit, depending on the timing. And again, the notice to perform. Remember, before the notice to perform, there used to be a checkbox and you could check a box and then specify less time or more time. Well, that's gone. Now, notice to perform, it's 2 days, 2 days, 2 days. That's it. Can't be changed. So the effective removal of contingencies. So we know that remove contingencies, the short story is that the deposit becomes, oh, there's no guarantee of it to be returned anymore. We can't say it automatically goes to the seller because by true experience, we know that it doesn't always automatically always go to the seller. But the way I explain it is that, Mr. Buyer, if you cancel before the contingencies are removed, I guarantee 100% you'll get your deposit back plus any fees incurred. After the contingencies are removed, there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees that you will lose it all. There's no guarantees that I'll get any of it back for you. As my client, I promise to perform my fiduciary duty. And if you choose to cancel, I'll do my best to get as much of it as we can back for you. But there's no, after you remove contingencies or we're going non-contingent, there is no guarantee. And it's not easy. All right, removal of seller contingencies. The only real seller contingency there is sometimes there's a contingency for the seller to find the replacement property. So if that's the case, then yeah, you work with that contingency. Demand to close escrow. That's if the party is not closing escrow. But a demand to close escrow may not be delivered any earlier than 3 days prior to the scheduled performance day for the close of escrow. If the DCE is incorrectly delivered or specifies a time less than the agreed time, the DCE shall be deemed invalid and void, and seller or buyer shall be required to deliver a new demand to close escrow. Demand to close escrow and notice a buyer to perform or notice to perform. Guys, you don't have to wait for them to not do something in order to serve those documents, right? So if a buyer is coming to you with a 5-day contingency for everything, and your seller is adamant, or you may have a great backup offer or whatnot, that you want, if these guys don't remove these contingencies in 5 days, we're out, right? On day 3, you send the notice to perform. That gives them 2 days, the other 2 days in the contract, right? And then you can cancel them right on the deadline. So you don't have to wait for the deadline in order to serve the notice. It's a 2-day notice to perform. You can serve it 2 days before the deadline. Those are aggressive listing strategies. You might upset the buyer sometimes. If you have a great relationship with the other side, without first discussions, might not be a good idea to send these things over, but nevertheless, you can understand that. And there may be a situation, right? You may accept an offer and the next day a better offer might come and you're like, oh man, we wish we'd taken this one. Well, what happens? Well, you just notice the performance go out early. And I would let the other side know that, hey, I'm not doing this because I don't like you. I'm not doing this because your buyer's bad or anything. I'm doing this because we have something better. And if you're not going to comply or close on time, we're out. Like right away. Just let you know. So hopefully they remove their contingencies and perform if their intention is to move forward and close. All right, brokers and agents. This part's is kind of important, right? For compensation, seller or buyer or both, as applicable, agree to pay compensation to the broker as specified in the separate written agreement. So if you have a buyer broker agreement, there's your separate written agreement. Listing agreement, separate written agreement. Or if you need to use a broker compensation agreement, if the property's off market. The scope of duty. This one is important because it kind of explains what we do and what we don't do. And I think we need to understand that as much as the clients, right? The buyer and seller acknowledge and agree that the agent does not decide what price the buyer should pay or seller should accept. The agent does not decide what price the buyer should pay or the seller should accept. The buyer decides and the seller decides, right? The agent does not guarantee the condition of the property. The agent does not guarantee the performance, adequacy, or completeness of inspections, services, products, or repairs provided or made by sellers or others. Does not have an obligation to conduct an inspection of common areas or areas off the site of the property. The agent shall not be responsible for identifying defects on the property in common areas or off-site unless such defects are visually observable by an inspection of reasonable accessible areas of the property that are known to the agent. The agent shall not be responsible for inspecting public records or permits concerning the title or use of the property. The agent shall not be responsible for identifying the location of boundary lines or other items affecting title. Shall not be responsible for verifying square footage, representations of others, or information contained in investigation reports, multiple listing service, advertisements, flyers, or other promotional materials. He shall not be responsible for determining the fair market value of the property or any personal property included in the sale. You know, it's funny they mentioned that we're not responsible for the price like already twice in this one paragraph. I wonder if there's a perception problem that the agents are somehow responsible for these prices. We're not. We're just good at strategies to get the most, right? But we're not responsible. Because sometimes providing a clean house is a consultation, right? Some people don't know that a clean house would sell for that. Just that, in and of itself. All right. The agent shall not be responsible for providing legal or tax advice regarding any aspect of a transaction entered into by buyer or seller. And the agent shall not be responsible for providing other advice or information that exceeds the knowledge, education, and experience required to perform real estate license activity, which is not really little. Buyers and sellers agree to seek legal, tax, insurance, title, and other desired assistance from appropriate professionals. Basically, guys, stay in your lane. We're not tax advisors, we're not lawyers, although sometimes we like to try to be. I personally watch way too much LA Law. It's a great show, but yeah, I sometimes have to remind myself I didn't go to law school. I just watched LA Law, so I am not a lawyer. I'm not an accountant either. And you know, offering tax advice is something that agents like to do on a regular basis. So just be careful. Be careful. We do have this lovely paragraph to protect us and make sure that the buyers read it and understand what we do and don't do. Sometimes there's a perception of the agents being responsible for the price. And I think mainly that has to do with, well, some agents know how to get more for a certain property. We do that by presenting the property and, you know, helping the seller maximize. But we still don't force the seller to accept any specific price. That's up to the seller to accept. It's up to the buyer to make the offer. All right. The Joint escrow instructions, the escrow holder, I think these are pretty much the same as they were in the previous agreement. The selection of service providers, the agents do not guarantee the performance of any vendor, service, or product providers. Right? If you hire a bad inspector, you hire a bad inspector. I like to provide options for folks, but when it comes to inspectors and things of that nature, a lot of times we're scheduling and putting that together. We just make sure that the other part, the side agrees. Most cases, they have to agree they're going to be paying for it. At some point, they have to write the check. All right, multiple listing service. The agents are authorized to report to the MLS an offer has been accepted. Obviously, we're complying with the rules of the MLS. Biggest issue that we've had with MLS and buyers and sellers post fact is to deal with pictures. Sometimes the buyers, the new house, don't want pictures of the inside of their house all over the internet. But any pictures, videos, floor plans, or other information about the property that has been or will be input into the MLS or internet portals or both at the instruction of seller or in compliance with MLS rules will not be removed after close of escrow. California Civil Code 1088 requires the MLS to maintain such images and information for at least 3 years. And as a result, they may be displayed or circulated on the internet, which cannot be controlled or removed by seller or agents. And seller, seller's agent, buyer's agent, and MLS have no obligation or ability to remove such images or information from the internet. So basically, it takes it all off our shoulders. If the buyer wants to have their pictures removed, it is up to them. They can, at their time, effort, and expense, contact Zillow, Redfin, Trulia, or all the third-party sites that are public-facing and have those photos removed. But it's not our job. It's not our problem.
Okay. Can I ask?
According to this contract,
Yeah.
please.
So this is new?
Yeah.
Okay, because up till now, I've always had people ask, you know, can you remove this for me, remove that? So you're saying now that the MLS is stating that they have to keep it for at least 3 years.
Yes.
Got it.
Yes.
No, that I like, because oftentimes I go back to reference a sold property, and I run into this thing where it's been taken, the pictures have been removed, except in the first one.
Yeah.
Right, and then I cannot see the condition of the property to make a true comparison.
Right. And therein also lies the problem, because they do state that those pictures need to stay up, but they don't say that every picture, they don't stipulate that every video must remain. So as we know, if you've listed a property before, once you hit sold, your control is gone.
Exactly.
And MLS isn't, based on this now, the MLS isn't going to be compelled to do anything. If it's important for your buyer to not have those pictures and they're adamant, then you must contact that listing agent prior to close of escrow. If it's me prior to close of escrow, we have control. Prior to close of escrow, I can go and hit the delete button a few times for you. It's not a problem. So if you want those pictures removed prior to close of escrow, let the listing agent know, and we could remove most of them.
But the listing agent doesn't have to comply with what we request.
No.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
No, they may need to be compelled in other ways.
Okay.
That's beyond the scope of my staying in my lane now. Attorney's fees and costs, any action, proceeding, or arbitration between buyer and seller arising out of this agreement, the prevailing buyer or seller shall be entitled to reasonable attorney fees and costs from the non-prevailing buyer or seller, except as provided in paragraph 30A. Ultimately, willfully violating the terms of the contract is just not recommended. Anything can be mitigated or negotiated, but simply not performing is not really an option. Because if it goes to the legal channels and you have no case to win, what's the point of losing and paying legal fees on top of cost of losing? All right, assignment. The buyer, it's interesting that they address assignment a little more thoroughly in this contract. The assignment is if the buyer chooses to delegate the contract to a different party. Remember on the first three sections there, we could kill that completely and say this contract is completely not assignable. But if you don't do that, then yeah, the buyer shall have the right to assign the buyer's interest in the agreement to the buyer's own trust or to own any whole owned entity of buyer that has existed at the time of such an assignment. The buyer shall not assign all or any part of the buyer's interest in this agreement without first having obtained the separate written consent of the seller to specified assignee. Such consent shall not be unreasonably withheld. Prior to any assignment, buyer shall disclose to seller the name of the assignee and the amount of any monetary consideration between buyer and assignee. This directly addresses the wholesale situation. Wholesalers are basically third parties that try to get themselves paid in a real estate transaction.
So what's the bottom line of what we're saying?
The bottom line is, if you want the property to not be, if you don't want the power to be given to the buyer, then make it not assignable. The buyer, even if it's not, the buyer can still assign it to their trust, but not to a third party. If they do, they need written confirmation from the seller, including any money that they're making on that needs to be disclosed. All right, equal housing opportunity, that doesn't change. And definitions and instructions are pretty much the same. Counting days is done as follows unless otherwise agreed. The first day after an event is the first full calendar date following the event and ending at 11:59 p.m. For example, if a notice of buyer to perform is delivered at 3 p.m. on the 7th calendar day of the month, or acceptance of a counteroffer is personally received at noon on the 7th calendar day of the month, then the 7th is day 0 for purposes of counting days to respond to the NBP or calculating the close of escrow date or contingency removal dates. And the 8th of the month is day 1 for the same purposes. So the moment you guys make the deal, it's day 0. The next day is day 1. Otherwise, definitions, counting days, delivered days, all pretty much the same. Terms and conditions of the offer. Right, if at least one but not all parties initial a counteroffer is required until agreement is reached. The seller has the right to continue to offer the property for sale and to accept any other offer at any time prior to notification of acceptance, and to market the property for backup offers after acceptance. The parties have read and acknowledged receipt a copy of the offer and agree to the confirmation of agency relationships. If the offer is accepted and the buyer subsequently defaults, the buyer may be responsible for payment of broker's compensation. This agreement, any supplemental addendum or modification, including any copy, may be signed or two more counterparts. Wow, that's interesting, right? If the buyer subsequently defaults, the buyer may be responsible for payment of broker's compensation. I like that.
That's new.
That is new.
That's a big deal. Buyer needs to understand that, right?
Yes. Yes, the buyer. I think ultimately it comes down to intentions, right? If the buyer, for all intentions, is intending to close escrow on a property, and for some reason they lose their job or they don't sabotage or submarine something, it's one thing. But if it's a wholesaler whose never intention is to close escrow, and they're playing games and they're delaying things, looking for side buyers, things of that nature, yeah, then they could be held liable for our compensation.
Does this also go to the buyer who just wakes up the next morning and changes his mind and doesn't want to put the 3% in?
I believe so. The buyer that wakes up the next morning, changes his mind and doesn't put the 3% in is in violation of the purchase agreement. They are subject to a variety of lawsuits arising from that. It's one thing to change your mind and go through the process. Okay, I read this contract, I committed to putting this money into escrow. I have a contingency that I can back out on. Okay, put the money in escrow.
Right.
Adhere to the contract.
Yeah.
The contract states that you have the right to inspect the property. It doesn't state that you must spend $1,000 on inspections. It doesn't say that. It says you have the right to inspect the property. So go tomorrow, look at it. I don't like it. Get my deposit back. Then you follow the process. But you can't just say, wake up the next morning and not follow the process. If you don't process the deposit, you're in default of the contract. And then if you're in default of the contract, you can be sued, absolutely. For more than liquidated damages. If those damages are, well, yeah, you only get liquidated damages if you're adhering to the contract and things aren't working out. If you're not adhering, if you're with all purpose and intent breaking the contract, then the liquidated damages clause doesn't apply.
Got it.
Or may not apply. Let's put it that way.
So, like the situation we had this year where Kenny's client woke up the next morning and said, I don't want to buy this house. And he wanted 3%. He didn't want to put the 3% in at all. Oh, no, I'm sorry. He put the 3% in already.
Mhm.
And then changed his mind like an hour or two later.
Okay.
And we went to the listing agent, explained to the listing agent, said, well, you know, you gotta pay, you know, we want to keep about 3/4 of your liquidated damages. And I negotiated with him, we brought it down to $5,000, which is really a win. But the buyer kept fighting and saying, you know, I shouldn't have to pay 5,000. And I was saying, you're breaking the contract.
Yeah.
So this is lucky,
Yeah.
right?
No,
So if
you're
that happens, so we could try and negotiate, but it doesn't mean that we're gonna get it.
That's right.
Actually, by law, they should be able to take that 3%.
They should, especially if they've suffered a loss. They may have to document that they've suffered a loss, but that's not all that complex to do necessarily, right? You can have opportunity costs, so forth and so on, of not having that money on that day like you were promised, right?
Got it,
You could have invested in Bitcoin.
got it.
So there's no guarantees that the deposit will go one way or the other. You use whatever leverage that you can to try to get a favorable result for your client. Like your client wakes up the next day and has that happen, it sucks, but yeah, you have to do what you can to get the most you can back for your client, which may mean having those unpleasant conversations with the listing agent.
But what I like about what you're doing here, and especially the highlighted areas, it tells me that these are the things that we should make sure we go over with every buyer, and maybe even get them a sample of this and say, we want to make sure you understand all of this. right?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Giving a buyer a sample of the purchase agreement is a great idea. Even before this, you should have been doing that with the previous purchase agreement too. But it's a great practice when you're in your initial buyer consultation so that they can become comfortable with it.
Yeah.
You know, hopefully you only have to explain it to them one time, right? And you win. But okay, you don't win the first time. The second time should go much faster because the verbiage doesn't change. Right? Time is of the essence. Entire contract and changes. The time is of the essence. Want to make sure that all the timelines are followed. But if you want to enforce time is of the essence, you must adhere to time is of the essence. So make sure that you are adhering to the contract timelines. If the clients are not ready to act on a disclosure, get an extension. If the clients are not ready to act or close escrow like they're supposed to, negotiate an extension. Do that ahead of time. That way it keeps all time is of the essence as part of the deal. If you're a listing agent and you're not enforcing time is of the essence, you let them slide on their contingency removals, you let them slide, put their deposit in late, contingencies are removed late. Now they're not closing escrow. Surprise, surprise, right? But your enforcement of that may be compromised because you did not adhere to time is of the essence throughout the contract. And now the buyer is dragging their feet. They're waiting for the interest rate to drop a quarter point, which could happen any day, right? So you're frustrated, they're stringing you along, and there's not much you can do about it because you did not adhere to time is of the essence throughout the contract. Yvette, did you have a question? Okay.
Sorry, just scratching my head.
Right, the legally authorized signers. Sometimes we're buying with trusts, making sure that the people that are signing are authorized to do so. But the legally authorized signer represents that the entity for which that person is acting already exists and is in good standing to do business in California. And they shall deliver to the other party and escrow holder within 3 days after acceptance the evidence of authority to act in that capacity. So they may have to send, send over the copy of the trust. Title is going to ask for it anyway, because they're going to pull up the title report. They'll see it's in a trust. And they'll make sure that paperwork's right. They don't want to write a check. All right, liquidated damages, that stays the same. Again, if it's going to be an owner-occupied property, then the liquidated damages is limited to 3% of the purchase price, which is how we come up with that magic number for 3% as the earnest money deposit. All right. Mediation arbitration. Whether or not you decide to go through arbitration is irrelevant. The mediation process should be followed. Now, what happens if they don't follow mediation and the guy's like pissed off and his brother's a lawyer and they want to sue? They can't. They just lose that ability to get the winner. The winner gets the loser to pay their legal fees. If you don't go through mediation first, you don't get that. You don't get that. So yeah, you don't have to go through mediation, but then if you don't go through mediation, the loser does not pay the legal fees of the winner. Arbitration is a mediation process. It is legally binding. It's a lot less expensive than litigation. So it says the agent shall not be obligated nor compelled to mediate or arbitrate unless they agree to do so in writing. Any agents participating in mediation or arbitration shall not be deemed a party to this agreement. Which means we are not the judge of the contracts, guys, right? We may bring in someone as an arbiter, but they cannot be, that arbiter cannot be the person, the agents on the deal. They have to be an independent third party.
So we cannot get called in on our deal.
No. Not to arbitrate. You can get called in to testify. You can get called in and question, but not as an arbitrator. You're not mitigating.
I see what you're saying.
You're not in the middle of deciding what happens to what, where, and how. All right. Out for expiration. This is the same as it was before. I love this 32C. The RPA has 16 pages. The buyer acknowledges receipt of and has read and understands every page. Understands every page and all attachments that make up the agreement. So there's none of this, oh, I didn't understand what I was signing. All right, if there's more than 2 signers, use the additional signing addendum. The acceptance of the offer, if the seller accepts the offer, they can accept it subject to a counteroffer, right? If there's any terms they don't like, not just the price, guys, contingency, if they don't like the close of escrow day, it's a counteroffer. If they don't like the contingency times, it's a counteroffer. See, a lot of times we like to do that by addendum. It's not proper. All right. And then the 16th, 33C, the seller, right? The RPA has 16 pages, Mr. Seller. The seller acknowledges receipt of and has read and understands every page and of all attachments that make up the agreement. So don't sign it, Mr. Seller or buyer, unless you do. There is a box that the offer was not accepted. Is this a must box to be completed if the seller rejects the contract? No, it is not. It is not mandatory. The seller owes you nothing. They owe you nothing. Complete the offer. Once the offer expires, their inaction makes the offer rejected. They don't have to write it. Is it good form to do so? Yes, it is good form. It is good form as a listing agent if you want to be transparent. Then have the seller initial that the offer was presented. And then the real estate broker section, guys, again, number one on the real estate broker section, it says the real estate agents are not parties to the agreement between the buyer and the seller. So again, guys, this is between a buyer and seller. We are not a party to this agreement. If you're giving any credits back, don't make yourself a party of this agreement. You make a separate written agreement. Okay. And again, just because the buyer and seller initialed the arbitration mediation clause does not mean you're covered for the arbitration mediation clause. If you want to be covered with arbitration between you and your client, there is a separate arbitration agreement that you can sign. All right, cooperating broker compensation. We all need to know how we're getting paid, right? Seller's broker agrees to pay buyer's broker, and buyer's broker agrees to accept out of the seller's broker proceeds in escrow the amount specified in the MLS, provided buyer's broker is a participant of the MLS in which the property is offered for sale or a reciprocal MLS. If seller's broker and buyer's broker are not both participants of the MLS or a reciprocal MLS in which the property is offered for sale, then compensation must be specified in a separate written agreement, the CBC. Declaration of license and tax may be used to document that tax reporting will be required or that an exemption exists. If the compensation offered on the MLS is inadequate, we just need to have a new form broker compensation agreement, and that will cover that. All right, the presentation of the offer pursuant to the National Association of Realtors Standard of Practice 1 through 7. If buyer's agent makes a written request, seller's agent shall confirm in writing that this offer has been presented to the seller. So checking that box will suffice, of course. I would expect that any offer I write would be presented. Sometimes I question it. You never know, but just to be sure, it'd be good to request that they do. If the offer is rejected, sign that rejection form. Now, guys, let's be reasonable with this too. Like if you're offer one of 32, though your chances are probably small. Chances of getting that written back are not great, right? But if you're one of 2 or one of 3, or if you know you're the only offer on the table and the seller's so not going for it, then I'd say, hey, you know what? Please verify that it's been presented by having them initial the box. AJ, question.
I'm sorry, would you repeat the purpose of the advantage of that for the buyer? Having that signed?
One more time.
What's the advantage for the buyer of having the rejection?
Oh, just to validate that your offer was presented. Right.
And that will be one.
Well, at least you know that the seller saw the offer. Sometimes we question these things. Did the guy really present the offer? We think it's a good offer. They should have at least given us a counter offer. What do you mean they just disappeared? Did they even present the offer? We don't even know, right?
Or if you see a listing agent who is, I've seen this, there's a particular listing agent I'm thinking of who tends to double end.
Yeah,
And if you're suspicious in any way, then you just have to make sure they sign it.
exactly.
In particular, that's good for your relationship with your client.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah. Just being transparent. Yeah, I don't think that's a problem with any of us. I think most of us, Keller Williams agents are very transparent. That's part of our culture.
We lost you.
Yeah. That I can. Because we're done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
You guys have any questions or concerns?
Appreciate the detailed walk.
Very well. Thank you guys for playing with me on the Zoom.
Thank you,